ripple echo.
And we all have this feeling that I came into this world. Now, it isn't true. You came out of this world.
Continuing. Power, trade, and the rule of law. Today we focus on IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Originally designed to fence in executive power, IEEPA, sometimes referred to as IEPA by the machine, has evolved into something far more flexible, far more expansive, and far more controversial. The machine ran the statute through its timeline: Cold War constraints, post-9/11 acceleration, and the Trump-era reinvention of emergency power as an economic weapon. Now let's see what turned up.
Imagine a president with just the stroke of a pen could drastically alter the cost of everything you buy. Tell companies where they can and can't invest, maybe even restrict the apps you use every day, all by declaring an emergency. It sounds pretty extreme, right? How did U.S. presidents actually gain such sweeping economic power?
It does sound almost like science fiction, doesn't it? That kind of unilateral power over the economy. It feels fundamentally un-American in a way. Yet it's tied to a very specific piece of legislation that has, well, evolved dramatically over time.
Yeah, the expanding use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. We've pulled together a stack of sources, reports, legal analyses, historical summaries, really how a law that was originally intended for very targeted sanctions in genuine acute emergencies has kind of morphed into this incredibly potent and, let's be honest, pretty controversial tool that presidents are now wielding for much broader trade and economic goals.
Yeah, it's really the story of a law that was maybe meant for a surgical strike becoming more like a blunt instrument. Our material really highlights the unexpected journey this single piece of legislation has taken over the decades.
It absolutely does. So in this deep dive, we're going to trace the origins of IEPA right back to the post-Watergate era, which is interesting because that was a time when Congress was actually trying to limit executive power. We'll look at its original intent, how it was used historically, primarily for very specific targeted sanctions. Then we'll shift gears a bit and examine how recent administrations have really pushed the boundaries of this law. We'll look at specific high-profile cases, things that grabbed headlines from tariff threats to tech bans, and the strategic use of export controls.
And we'll also need to dig into the significant domestic concerns. This all raises serious questions about executive overreach, the potential for real constitutional friction when these emergency powers start butting up against the normal functions of government.
Right. And we really can't ignore the far-reaching international implications either. How has this impacted global trade rules? What kind of, complex reactions are we seeing from allies and adversaries? And how is it actually reshaping international norms around economic statecraft? It's a big picture.
You could think of this as trying to understand the emergency button on the president's desk that, seems to have no off switch, and the significant legal and institutional weight that gets thrown around when trade law effectively becomes presidential decree.
So our mission here is to extract the most important insights from all this material we've gathered, helping you become well-informed on this crucial and frankly evolving topic quickly and thoroughly. So, at its heart, IEPA is a law passed in 1977. It grants the president incredibly broad authority over economic transactions, and this is key only following a specifically declared national emergency related to an unusual and extraordinary threat originating largely from abroad.
And that's precisely where the tension lies, isn't it? The law came out of a desire to rein things in, but it ended up granting immense power once that specific trigger was pulled. The original intent, as you said, was quite narrow thinking at targeted measures against hostile states or very specific threats. But its modern use, it really blurs the line between a genuine national security emergency and what starts to look a lot like routine trade or economic policy.
Right. It's like, if you want an analogy, maybe IEPA was designed to be like a precise political crowbar, meant for prying open solutions in very specific, dire emergencies. But what we're seeing now is it increasingly being used for sort of general leverage in everyday policy disputes.
Maybe we should unpack this history first. Where exactly did it come from?
Absolutely. Let's start there. Our sources really point out that IEPA was enacted in 1977, right in the thick of those post-Watergate reforms, which were aimed squarely at constraining presidential power.
That context is absolutely critical. After the Vietnam War and Watergate, there was this strong bipartisan consensus that presidents had accumulated too much unchecked power, including these emergency powers. So IEPA was specifically designed to put limits and a framework around that. It was intended to strike a careful balance, really, between the need for swift executive action in a real crisis and the fundamental principle of congressional oversight. It actually replaced an older law, the Trading with the Enemy Act, or TWEA, but it shifted the authority for peacetime emergencies from that old wartime framework to this new IEPA structure.
So it's kind of ironic, isn't it, that a law born out of a desire to limit power is now seen by some as enabling overreach. You mentioned the trigger that declared national emergency in response to an unusual and extraordinary threat, largely from abroad. What kind of economic controls does that actually unlock?
Well, once that declaration is made, the powers are, as the sources consistently describe them, notoriously broad. I mean, we're talking about the authority to freeze assets, to block financial transactions, and crucially, to regulate the import or export of property in which a foreign country or any of its nationals have an interest.
And the statute's language is really expansive there. One analysis we looked at notes it grants authority to regulate the importation or exportation of any property in which any foreign country or a national thereof has any interest. That broad wording has essentially become the legal foundation for most U.S. sanctions programs targeting specific entities, individuals, or regimes over the years.
Exactly. And historically, that was the primary use. It wasn't intended as a blank check for general trade policy. Remember, Congress specifically passed IEPA to rein in previous unchecked uses of the old Trading with the Enemy Act during peacetime. The historical practice under IEPA was targeted, freezing assets of hostile regimes, imposing embargoes on rogue states, targeting terrorists or those involved in proliferation activities. That's a stark contrast to using it for broad tariffs or general trade measures, which, well, we'll definitely get to.
And that contrast is only amplified by the fact that these emergencies, they often aren't temporary at all. The sources really highlight this trend, a growing number and significantly duration of active emergencies declared under IEPA. As of early 2024, presidents had declared 69 such emergencies since 1977, and a remarkable 39 of those are still ongoing.
Think about that for a second. 39 ongoing national emergencies. The average duration for these active emergencies is over 9 years. And the most striking example cited again and again is the emergency declared way back in 1979 during the Iran hostage crisis. That emergency is still in effect today, over 40 years later, simply renewed annually by subsequent presidents.
Wow. So something that started as a response to a very specific acute crisis, the hostage situation, has essentially become this permanent state of affairs that underpins ongoing Iran sanctions.
Yeah.
This pattern clearly illustrates how powers granted for a temporary emergency can, in practice, become this enduring tool of executive governance. It's really against this backdrop, this sort of perpetual emergency environment, that recent presidents have felt empowered maybe to use IEPA in truly unprecedented ways, raising these significant questions about the proper scope of the law today.
Yeah, it really makes you ask, how does something intended as a temporary emergency-only power effectively become a decades-long tool for policy? This pattern provides the context for everything that follows, I think. It shows how the ground was perhaps already fertile for presidents to push the boundaries of IEP well beyond its original limited intent.
It certainly sets the stage. Thinking back, IEPA came out of Congress trying to limit power. It requires a foreign threat, it grants really broad economic controls, and historically it was for targeted bad actors. But these emergencies often just stick around.
Yeah, that idea of emergency powers becoming permanent fixtures is really key to understanding the shift we're talking about. Okay, so with that foundation, let's look at where things really start to get interesting, or perhaps concerning, depending on your view, in recent history.
Right, that brings us squarely to the Trump administration. Our sources really zero in on how willing that administration was to test the outer limits of IEPA. Yes, and crucially, to test its limits for purposes that were clearly trade objectives, or tied to issues that weren't traditionally viewed as national security emergencies in the IEPA context. It really marked a pretty significant and controversial shift.
The headline example, the one everyone remembers, cited is the May 2019 threat to impose tariffs on Mexico. This wasn't framed around unfair trade practices or a specific security threat from Mexico, but was explicitly linked by President Trump to a crisis at the U.S. southern border involving illegal immigration and drug flows.
And the announcement itself was, well, unconventional, delivered via Twitter, if I recall correctly. He announced a 5% tariff on all goods from Mexico, threatening to escalate it up to 25% until the illegal immigration problem is remedied. It was a total surprise and sent shockwaves is probably the right word.
Shockwaves not just diplomatically, but domestically too. Industry groups were immediately up in arms, calling it a grave error and warning it would create significant economic disruption for American businesses and consumers who rely so heavily on trade with Mexico.
What made this truly unprecedented, legally speaking, was how Trump grounded this tariff threat in IEEPA. He formally declared the flow of migrants and drugs across the border to be a national emergency. And then he asserted that this emergency justified using IEEPA to impose broad tariffs on all goods from Mexico. This linkage of an emergency declaration, especially one tied to a domestic issue like border crossings, even if framed as a foreign threat, to broad trade measures was absolutely unprecedented in IEEPA's nearly 50-year history.
And let's be clear, the IEEPA statute itself doesn't even mention the word tariff. Any action taken under IEEPA has to bear a direct connection to the declared emergency. As the sources point out, it was incredibly difficult, perhaps legally tenuous, to argue convincingly that across-the-board tariffs on all Mexican imports, everything from cars to avocados, directly addressed migrant caravans or fentanyl trafficking.
This legal theory immediately sparked immense skepticism among legal experts and trade scholars. They really questioned whether imposing tariffs, which function more like taxes and are constitutionally Congress's domain, could possibly fall under IEEPA's authority to regulate imports or exports of property where a foreign country has an interest. Now, while the tariffs never actually went into effect, Mexico entered negotiations and reached an agreement a week later. Averting them, the episode set this precedent in principle. It asserted that a president could claim the power under IEEPA to unilaterally impose tariffs on a major trading partner for reasons far outside traditional trade disputes.
And this wasn't just a one-off instance. The sources detail other examples reflecting Trump's expansive view of executive authority over trade. This included aggressive use of Section 301 investigations against China, leading to tariffs, and Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, which were also justified on national security grounds, even against close allies. He also explicitly signaled interest in using IEEPA for broader economic decoupling from China, maybe most notably an August 2019 order directing U.S. firms to seek alternatives to doing business in China, which many interpreted as foreshadowing a potential IEEPA action.
There were also discussions, maybe even early executive orders drafted in early 2020, reportedly under IEEPA authority, that aimed to impose new tariffs on imports from China, Canada, and Mexico, justified by issues like fentanyl trafficking. But these were apparently quickly paused or significantly scaled back due to, well, legal doubts and intense diplomatic pushback.
This aggressive stance triggered significant legal backlash, as we mentioned, but it also spurred Congress into action. Even just the threat of the Mexico duties galvanized lawmakers. By mid-2019, we saw bipartisan legislation introduced specifically designed to amend IEEPA to explicitly prohibit its use for tariffs or quotas.
This was the Trade Certainty Act, S2413, spearheaded by Senators Tom Carper, a Democrat, and Pat Toomey, a Republican. Their bill explicitly stated that tariffs, quotas, or duties should be off limits under IEEPA because, in their view, and that of the sources, the law's 1977 framers never envisioned it being used as a broad tariff power.
What's really telling, I think, is that a version of this reform bill actually passed the Senate Homeland Security Committee by voice vote in 2019. This reflected rare bipartisan agreement, as one source put it, that the Trump administration's interpretation of IEEPA for tariffs went clearly too far. Now, while these measures didn't ultimately become law, they strongly underscore the deep concern within Congress about executive overreach and the perceived need for the legislative branch to reassert its constitutional control over tariffs and trade. So remember that Mexico tariff threat. It wasn't just a diplomatic kerfuffle, it was an unprecedented legal maneuver under IEEPA that sparked real bipartisan legislative pushback, even if the bill didn't pass.
Another really high-profile, though ultimately unsuccessful, use of IEEPA during the Trump era was the attempt to ban popular Chinese-owned mobile apps like TikTok and WeChat.
Oh yeah, the app bans. In the summer of 2020, President Trump issued executive orders declaring these apps a national security threat. The concern cited was data harvesting and the potential for the Chinese government to use the apps for surveillance or influence operations, that kind of thing. Under IEEPA, he prohibited U.S. transactions with the parent companies, ByteDance and Tencent, which would have effectively banned the apps by preventing app stores from distributing them or companies from doing business with them.
But these orders faced immediate legal challenges, not just arguing they were an overreach, but specifically on statutory and constitutional grounds. Critically, IEPA contains an exemption, often called the Berman Amendment, which explicitly states that presidential authority under the Act does not include the power to regulate transactions involving certain things, including informational materials or personal communications.
And TikTok and WeChat argued quite strongly that the content on their platforms, the videos, the messages, the social media interactions, clearly falls under this exemption. The Berman Amendment, which was first passed in 1988 and later strengthened, was specifically designed to protect the free flow of information and communications from being shut down by emergency economic powers.
And federal courts agreed, at least partially. In October 2020, a U.S. District Court judge issued a preliminary injunction blocking the TikTok ban. The judge found that the administration's actions likely exceeded statutory authority and intruded into an IEPA-free zone, specifically protecting personal communication and information flow. The court basically doubted that a broadly popular social media app could be summarily outlawed using emergency economic powers without running afoul of both the statute's specific carve-outs and fundamental values like the First Amendment.
A different judge also blocked the WeChat order, similarly noting that it burdened core speech and association rights, and that the administration hadn't clearly demonstrated that the ban was necessary given less restrictive alternatives were available.
Think about the apps on your phone right now. What would you do? How would it impact your life if a president could just ban them with a pen stroke by citing a national security emergency? These cases show that even in that scenario, the courts might, and in these instances did, step in to apply legal limits.
Exactly. These cases are really important because they didn't directly challenge the president's claim that the apps posed a national security risk. Instead, they established that even within an emergency declaration, IEEPA has limits defined by Congress. The president cannot simply ignore explicit statutory exemptions like the Berman Amendment, and actions that implicate fundamental rights like free speech or association will trigger careful judicial scrutiny. As you know, the bans never actually went into effect. The Biden administration later reviewed and revoked Trump's orders. This whole episode ultimately showed both the potential reach of IEPA attempting to target wildly popular consumer apps under a creative definition of threat and the restraints on that power, with courts upholding statutory boundaries and constitutional principles. The attempts to ban TikTok and WeChat showed the broad reach of IEEPA under a national security framing, but also key legal limits like the Berman Amendment and judicial review kicking in.
So to kind of wrap up the Trump era, it really revealed just how much potential leverage existed within IEPA for use in trade and broader economic matters far beyond traditional sanctions.
Yes, his aggressive uses and even the attempts that failed set new precedents. They demonstrated a clear willingness to try and repurpose emergency powers for policy goals that looked a lot like trade protectionism or, technological nationalism.
And this naturally raised alarms about executive overreach, triggering significant pushback from multiple corners: Congress, industry, and the judiciary. The legacy of this period, I think, is a heightened awareness of IEP's sheer potency and perhaps the fragility of traditional separation of powers when this law is stretched beyond its perceived intent. Okay, so that covers the Trump administration's significant expansion of IEPA use. Just to quickly check ourselves, we saw the unprecedented tariff threats over Mexico, the resulting bipartisan legislative pushback with the Trade Certainty Act, and the app bans that were challenged and ultimately blocked in court based on statutory exemptions like the Berman Amendment and fundamental rights. Those seem like some key takeaways from that period.
Right. Now let's turn our attention to Chapter 3, the Biden approach. Continuity, strategy, and new frontiers. The sources explain that President Biden inherited many of the dynamics and even some of the specific measures from the Trump administration. And while he's often positioned himself as more multilateral, his administration has also leaned heavily on unilateral economic powers.
Yes, the approach seems, in some ways, perhaps more conventionally focused on strategic security threats compared to some of Trump's more novel uses, particularly concerning China's rapid technological advancement and Russia's aggression. But the scale and sometimes the novelty of the actions are still very significant.
One prominent area is the use of strategic export controls on advanced technology. The October 2022 rules issued by the Commerce Department targeting China's access to advanced semiconductors and the manufacturing equipment needed to make them are a prime example. Now, these didn't require a new emergency declaration under IEEPA, but they were implemented under existing authority, specifically the Export Control Reform Act, which itself evolved from practices and authorities rooted in IEEPA principles. But they were clearly prompted by acute national security concerns, very much in the spirit of IEEPA, as one source puts it.
And the scope of these rules was truly sweeping. They not only barred China from obtaining certain high-end chips, but also prohibited companies anywhere in the world from using U.S. origin tools or software to supply China with those specific advanced chips. This dramatically expanded the extraterritorial reach of U.S. export controls with the clear aim of effectively kneecapping, as some described it, China's ability to develop its most advanced semiconductor industry and thus slowing its military modernization.
Industry experts at the time called it potentially the biggest shift in U.S. technology policy toward China since the 1990s. If fully effective, these measures could set China's domestic chip industry back by years, impacting everything from advanced AI development to military capabilities.
What's particularly notable about the initial rollout, though, is that these were unilateral executive actions. The U.S. acted without waiting for international consensus or formally coordinating with allies beforehand. U.S. officials, according to sources, openly acknowledged the risk that the controls could lose effectiveness over time if other countries don't join us by imposing similar restrictions.
Yeah, there was definite concern that if key allies like the Netherlands, home to major chip equipment makers like ASML, or Japan, another major player, didn't follow suit, China could potentially find alternative suppliers, and American companies would be put at a competitive disadvantage globally. While discussions with allied nations were indeed ongoing, formal commitments weren't secured at the exact moment the rules were announced. This really highlights a tension, doesn't it? The desire for speed and decisive action in a perceived urgent security threat versus the need for coordination and consensus building to ensure the measures are truly effective and don't alienate partners. Biden's sweeping tech export controls on China show the continued use of executive authority operating in the spirit of IEEPA and that tension between wanting to act fast unilaterally versus needing allied coordination.
The international reaction to these semiconductor controls was, well, predictably swift and strong, particularly from China. Beijing condemned the U.S. export controls as an abuse of trade measures intended to stifle China's development and filed a formal complaint at the WTO in December 2022.
China argued that these restrictions threatened the stability of the global industrial supply chains and were fundamentally about the U.S. maintaining its technological hegemony rather than addressing genuine national security needs.
The United States' response basically mirrored its position in earlier trade disputes under Trump. It asserted that its actions were necessary national security measures that are categorically exempt from WTO review. U.S. officials stated bluntly that the WTO is not the appropriate forum to discuss such issues, arguing that each country must be the sole judge of its own security requirements. This stance reinforces the U.S. view that its national security actions are self-judging and beyond the trade body's authority, a position that contributes to the ongoing paralysis of the WTO appellate body, effectively crippling its dispute settlement function.
And there were significant diplomatic undercurrents, too. While allies shared the underlying concerns about China's tech ambitions, many were uneasy about the lack of prior consultation before such impactful rules were dropped. Eventually, throughout 2023, some key allies did align with U.S. measures. The Netherlands and Japan, after extensive U.S. diplomatic efforts, agreed to impose their own limits on the export of certain advanced chip-making machines to China. But the initial unilateral rollout clearly strained relations and required a lot of after-the-fact damage control and coordination.
Beyond export controls on goods, the Biden administration has also pushed into a new area of economic statecraft using executive authority, regulating outbound investment flows for national security reasons. This is, as sources note, an arena not traditionally covered by export-import laws and represents a pretty novel application of presidential powers. In August 2023, President Biden issued an executive order directing a review of U.S. outbound investments in sensitive technologies directed towards countries of concern, specifically mentioning China.
This led to the development of new regulations, finalized in late 2024 and set to take effect in 2025. These rules will restrict U.S. private investments, things like venture capital, private equity, or joint ventures in Chinese companies involved in advanced semiconductors, quantum computing, and certain areas of artificial intelligence. For investments not outright prohibited, U.S. investors will be required to notify the government.
This move is consistently described as unprecedented. Historically, the U.S. has screened incoming foreign investments via the CAAUS process to prevent national security risks, but it has never systematically regulated the flow of U.S. capital out of the country. Lacking an explicit statutory framework from Congress for this, these controls fundamentally rely on presidential powers, arguably stemming from IEPA or similar authorities, by framing the outflow of U.S. expertise and capital that could aid rival military technologies as a national emergency threat.
The implications of this are huge. It signals that financial and technological decoupling, or at least de-risking, can now be pursued not just through trade or export controls, but also by executive fiat targeting private sector investment decisions, all in the name of national security. China has, unsurprisingly, strongly criticized these proposed investment curbs, and U.S. venture capital firms operating in China have voiced concerns about their impact. Nonetheless, there seems to be significant bipartisan political support in Washington for preventing U.S. money and expertise from contributing to China's military modernization or strategic tech goals.
This really exemplifies a new frontier in the use of emergency economic policy, one that other Western allies are also now grappling with and considering. It reinforces the precedent that authorities rooted in IEPA can be interpreted and applied to reach deep into the workings of globalization, even the seemingly purely private decisions of financial investors when framed under the broad umbrella of national security. A new frontier. Biden's move to restrict U.S. outbound investment in sensitive tech to China, using emergency-type powers, is unprecedented regulation of capital flows, really pushing the boundaries.
In parallel to these tech-focused measures, the Biden administration has actually been even more active than the Trump administration in using IEPA for traditional sanctions and entity blacklists, particularly targeting China. A 2024 analysis highlighted this, finding that Biden's team, quote, has exceeded the Trump administration in the number of financial sanctions and entity-based export controls placed on Chinese persons.
Yeah, the numbers bear this out pretty clearly. By late 2024, the Biden administration had added approximately 432 Chinese individuals or entities to the Treasury Department's specially designated nationals, or SDN list. That's the list that effectively cuts them off from the U.S. financial system. That's roughly double the 216 added during the Trump years. Similarly, Biden added 412 Chinese entities to the Commerce Department's export entity list, which restricts their access to U.S. technology significantly more than the 259 added under Trump.
These actions cover a range of issues, including sanctions on Chinese officials over human rights abuses in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, as well as trade blacklistings of tech companies linked to the Chinese military or state surveillance apparatus. Now, these types of targeted sanctions and blacklistings are very much in line with the historical use of IEEPA. But the sheer volume under Biden shows a continuity and even escalation of the economic pressure campaign against China, largely implemented through executive directives and regulations under IEPA or related laws.
Perhaps the most archetypal, clear-cut use of IEP under Biden, though, has been the response to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. This is a textbook case of an unusual and extraordinary threat from abroad. Within days of the invasion, President Biden declared a national emergency tied to Russia's actions and, importantly, acted in very close coordination with the EU and G7 allies to impose sweeping financial sanctions on Russia.
These measures, grounded in IEP and other relevant authority, included unprecedented steps like freezing the Russian central bank's foreign reserves held in Western institutions, cutting major Russian banks off from the SWIFT international payment system, and blacklisting numerous Russian oligarchs in key sectors of their economy. The speed and magnitude of this response were really unprecedented in economic statecraft. Trillions of dollars in Russian assets were effectively immobilized overnight by executive order.
Unlike some of the more unilateral trade measures we've discussed, this action had broad international support from a coalition of wealthy democratic nations. However, even this use, while broadly supported, set a precedent for just how far emergency economic war powers can extend without needing a single new act of Congress. Some international lawyers have raised complex questions about the legality under international law of measures like the potential permanent confiscation of those frozen central bank assets, touching on issues of sovereign immunity and property rights.
But the main point here is that when a clear and present security crisis arises, especially one with broad international condemnation, the president can marshal IEPA and related authorities to effectively wage economic war on a grand scale. And it demonstrated the executive branch's capacity to align a large coalition of other countries in such actions when diplomacy and interests align, a really stark contrast to the friction caused by some of Trump's more unilateral tariff moves. The massive Russia sanctions showed IEPA's immense power for coordinated economic war in a clear crisis, setting a major precedent for the scale of executive action.
So, to sort of summarize the Biden administration's use of these powers, we see a continuity in leveraging emergency economic tools, but often with a more explicit focus on strategic security goals, particularly concerning China's tech ambitions and Russia's geopolitical aggression. While his approach might appear more conventional or coordinated than some of Trump's actions, the uses are no less consequential, involving unprecedented measures like restricting outbound investment.
Right. Whether it's keeping existing tariffs, expanding export controls, or deploying sanctions on an unprecedented scale against Russia, these recent cases across two administrations all feed into the ongoing debate about the scope of executive power and the balance of power in U.S. governance today. Okay, so we see how IEEPA started, how the Trump administration pushed its limits, and how the Biden administration is using it in strategic, sometimes novel ways. Before we move on, let's just quickly check in. We covered Biden's significant tech export controls on semiconductors, which were large-scale and initially unilateral, causing some friction. We touched on the unprecedented move to regulate outbound investment, essentially using emergency-type authority for capital flows. And we saw the massive coordinated financial sanctions against Russia, showing the scale of economic power in a clear crisis. These are some key developments under Biden. Now let's turn our attention inward and look at Chapter 4, Domestic Tensions. Executive power, Congress, and the courts. The burgeoning use of IEEPA for broader trade and economic policy inevitably raises these fundamental questions about executive overreach and the separation of powers within the U.S. system.
The core conflict here is pretty clear if you just look at the Constitution itself. Article I explicitly vests the authority to regulate foreign commerce and to impose tariffs, which are essentially taxes on imports in the Congress. For most of U.S. history, Congress really guarded this power quite jealously.
And while Congress has delegated significant authority to the executive over time, particularly since the New Deal and certainly since the Cold War began, IEEPA represents one of the broadest delegations of economic power. And crucially, it was specifically granted for emergencies. So critics argue that when recent presidents use this emergency power for things that look like routine policy or protectionist trade measures, they are stretching it well beyond its intended purpose and effectively allowing the executive branch to bypass Congress's primary constitutional role in setting trade policy.
Using IEEPA to impose tariffs, in particular, is seen by many legal scholars and former officials as a direct affront to the separation of powers. Jennifer Hellman, a law professor and former trade negotiator whose analysis is cited in our sources, argues that allowing IEEPA to cover tariff policy would mean there are virtually no limits on the president's power to impose tariffs. She warns this, quote, can subvert the rule of law, undermine the Constitution, and its separation of powers.
Under that scenario, tariffs, which are basically taxes on imports and should go through the careful legislative process defined in the Constitution, would essentially escape that process entirely. Tariff policy would risk becoming, as she puts it, nothing more than the will of the president. This kind of concentration of the power to tax and regulate commerce in one person is precisely what the framers of the Constitution sought to prevent, by explicitly giving Congress the power of the purse and the power over commerce in Article 1.
And a relatively recent concept articulated by the Supreme Court, the Major Questions Doctrine, adds weight to this concern. This doctrine suggests that for agency actions, or in this case, arguably, presidential actions of vast economic and political significance, there must be clear congressional authorization, not just vague or implied authority. Imposing hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs on a major trading partner, as President Trump contemplated doing with Mexico under IEEPA, is arguably a decision of precisely that kind of vast economic and political significance.
And since IEEPA nowhere explicitly mentions tariffs as an authorized action, courts might find that using it to unilaterally rewrite the nation's tariff rates on a broad scale lacks the clear congressional authorization required by the Major Questions Doctrine for matters of such economic magnitude. It's a powerful legal argument against that expansive interpretation for tariffs. The debate over using IEEPA for tariffs boils down to a separation of powers issue. Congress's power to tax regulate commerce versus the president's emergency authority, raising these Major Questions Doctrine concerns.
Now, it's important to note that U.S. courts haven't had a definitive ruling on whether a president can use IEEPA for broad, across-the-board tariffs like the Mexico threat. That's largely because Trump's most extreme proposals were either averted by negotiation or reversed before a legal challenge could reach a final decision on the merits. However, legal challenges have been mounted in other IEEPA cases, as we've discussed.
Right. And those cases, like the 2020 challenges to the TikTok and WeChat bans we talked about earlier, are telling. While they didn't directly address the tariff question or the core separation of powers argument head on, they did demonstrate a willingness by the judiciary to scrutinize presidential IEPA actions and to block them when they clearly overstep explicit statutory bounds, like the informational materials exemption in the Berman Amendment.
Those tech ban cases set an important precedent. Even within a declared national emergency, the president's powers under IEEPA are not limitless. They remain subject to the constraints Congress wrote into the law and, more broadly, to constitutional protections. While courts often defer to the executive on national security judgments, these cases show they will step in to ensure the executive isn't acting outside the lines drawn by Congress or infringing on constitutional rights like free speech.
Politically, the growing and often controversial use of IEPA has led to a realization, shared across some parts of the political spectrum, that Congress perhaps needs to reassert its authority. As we mentioned, the moment Trump floated using IEEPA for Mexico tariffs, legislators quickly proposed specific amendments to IEEPA to clarify that it cannot be used for tariffs.
There have also been broader, though frankly quite difficult efforts to reform the National Emergencies Act, or NEA. This is the 1976 law that governs the process by which presidents declare national emergencies and, crucially, how they can be terminated. The NEA requires the president to report declarations to Congress and renew them annually. Congress can terminate an emergency by passing a joint resolution.
But here's the rub. That joint resolution is subject to a presidential veto. And ever since the 1983 Supreme Court ruling that struck down the legislative veto, a mechanism Congress previously used to overturn executive actions without needing presidential approval, terminating an emergency via joint resolution, requires Congress to override a potential presidential veto. That means needing a two-thirds majority in both the House and the Senate. That's an incredibly high political hurdle to clear in today's polarized environment.
In practice, this has made successful congressional termination of an IEEPA-based emergency exceedingly rare, almost impossible without overwhelming bipartisan consensus against the president. Sources suggest Congress had effectively never successfully terminated a specific IEEPA emergency until maybe 2023, though the context isn't perfectly clear if this applies to all types of IEEPA emergencies or just a specific case. But the overall point holds. The NEA framework provides a theoretical check, but in reality, it's very difficult for Congress to unilaterally end an emergency the president wants to keep going.
And this structural reality contributes significantly to the frustration that so many of these IEEPA emergencies have become effectively permanent. The fact that 39 are still ongoing, some stretching back decades like the 40-plus-year-old Iran emergency, feeds this perception that the exception intended for true emergencies has essentially swallowed the rule of normal governance.
While everyone acknowledges the president needs flexibility to act quickly in genuine foreign crises, there is significant concern among legal scholars and lawmakers about this open-ended delegation leading to an imperial presidency, particularly in economic affairs. As one commentator cited in the source's notes, over 90% of modern U.S. national emergency declarations invoke IEEPA, and the current system suggests that Congress has enabled the imperial presidency by continuously delegating its constitutional responsibilities to the executive without building in effective checks.
What does it mean for the fundamental system of checks and balances when an emergency power intended for a specific acute crisis becomes a routine tool used for decades on end? And reversing that state requires a legislative supermajority that Congress almost never achieves. Does that feel like the careful balance of power you probably learned about in civics class?
It's a really fundamental question facing the U.S. constitutional structure right now. The National Emergencies Act process makes it very hard for Congress to terminate an IEEPA emergency because of the presidential veto power, contributing to perpetual emergencies and concerns about an imperial presidency.
From a purely domestic perspective, the recent robust uses of IEEPA have clearly tipped the scales of the balance of power further towards the executive branch. The president now has this ability to act swiftly and decisively on matters of trade, investment, and financial flows that were once the domain of often painstaking legislative negotiation. And this swift executive action raises significant constitutional flags. The more these emergency economic actions become routine tools for policy rather than truly exceptional responses to acute, sudden crises, the more they risk eroding the essential check and balance that Congress is supposed to exert on economic policy, particularly concerning taxing and commerce.
That said, the situation is still very much evolving. We haven't seen a definitive Supreme Court ruling on the broadest possible interpretation of IEP, like using it for a blanket import tariff against Congress's wishes. Should a future president make such a bold move and be taken to court, we could potentially see a historic judicial pronouncement that more clearly delineates the boundary between legitimate emergency power and Congress's core legislative authority. Until such a ruling, each instance of IEEPA being used for broader economic purposes remains a test case, a test of how far the executive can push its claimed authority and whether the other branches or public pressure will push back effectively.
It's also impossible to discuss the expansion of executive power via IEEPA without acknowledging the political dynamics at play. In recent years, regardless of who is in the White House, there's been this trend of the executive branch accumulating more autonomy in foreign economic policy. And that's partly a function of, well, partisan polarization and legislative dysfunction in Congress.
When Congress is deeply divided, gridlocked, or simply unable to act swiftly on complex issues like strategic competition with China or responding to a global crisis, the president of whichever party feels this pressure and incentive to use the tools already at their disposal, the pen and phone, executive orders, and emergency powers to bypass the stalemate. Both Trump and Biden, despite their stylistic differences, have demonstrated this approach, acting decisively when Congress might have struggled to reach consensus.
And there's another political layer. Using IEEPA and similar powers can be domestically popular, or at least strategically appealing to key constituencies. Trump's tariffs, framed as standing up for American workers and industries, certainly had populist appeal. Biden's tech restrictions and China sanctions align with a growing bipartisan consensus that sees China as a strategic rival that needs to be confronted economically.
So, presidents often find that acting decisively through executive measures can score political points at home, even if it generates controversy among experts or allies. This reduces the political cost to the president of bypassing Congress, especially when Congress is divided on the issue itself.
And once these actions are taken, tariffs are imposed, sanctions lists are created, investment restrictions are put in place, they could become entrenched. Domestic industries that benefit lobby to keep the protections. Sanctions against adversaries gain support from human rights and security advocates. Winding these policies back can be politically difficult and costly, which effectively institutionalizes the executive action that Congress never specifically passed into law. As we saw, President Biden largely kept the Trump-China tariffs, despite some internal debate, partly because removing them could be politically framed as being soft on China.
So a significant unilateral move by one president can effectively create a new status quo that his successor feels politically compelled to maintain, boxing in the next administration, and further diminishing Congress's role over time.
That said, this growing reliance on executive emergency economic powers isn't without political concern within Congress either. There is an underlying unease among lawmakers across both parties about being sidelined on such important issues. This has occasionally led to some rare bipartisan alliances. You might find a progressive Democrat and a libertarian Republican agreeing on concerns about executive overreach in this domain.
Congressional hearings are held where administration officials are questioned, sometimes grilled, about the justifications for using these authorities. Think tanks and advocacy groups spanning the political spectrum, from groups like the Brennan Center focused on executive power to the Cato Institute focused on limited government, have issued reports highlighting the dangers of unchecked emergency powers and calling for reforms. This represents a slow-building political pressure to potentially recalibrate the balance.
So looking ahead, the interplay between executive and legislative roles in trade and foreign economic policy is really at a crossroads. If the current trends continue, we might see a de facto transfer of significant trade and economic security power to the executive become a permanent reality, with Congress's role limited to oversight or reacting at the margins. Or perhaps, if a president makes a significant miscalculation with an IEEPA action that causes broad economic harm or widespread public backlash, it could galvanize Congress into a more forceful effort to reclaim its constitutional authority.
It's a bit like the war powers debates of the 1970s, isn't it? After decades of presidents conducting military operations without formal declarations of war, Congress eventually tried to reassert control with the War Powers Resolution. We could potentially see a similar legislative push in the economic realm if these emergency trade actions are seen to go off the rails in a significant way.
In essence, the political dynamic surrounding IEEPA's expanded use reflects this core tension between the need for swift action and the demand for democratic accountability. Presidents find unilateral action expedient, especially in a divided political landscape, and Congress often lacks the cohesion or the political will to effectively stop it, particularly if the executive's actions have some measure of public support. but each instance contributes to a precedent that cumulatively diminishes Congress's role and could upset the constitutional balance. This shifting balance is not just a legal or constitutional issue, it's a deeply political one, and its trajectory depends on how future leaders and legislators choose to assert or yield their authority. Okay, so before we move on, let's quickly recap the domestic picture. We discussed how IEP's broad use and the relative difficulty of congressional checks raise serious questions about the constitutional balance of power, especially regarding trade and tariffs, which are traditionally Congress's job. While courts have shown some willingness to check the executive in specific cases like those app bans, the structure of the National Emergencies Act makes it tough for Congress to terminate ongoing emergencies. This leads to concerns about perpetual emergencies and executive overreach, even if there's underlying bipartisan unease in Congress. And politically, presidents often find unilateral action expedient, contributing to a dynamic where executive actions can become entrenched. That seems to cover the key domestic tensions we've been talking about. Right. Now let's zoom out and look at Chapter 5, Global Ripples, Strains on Trade, Allies, and Adversaries. The United States' recent robust use of IEEPA and other emergency economic measures for broader trade and economic goals has sent significant ripples throughout the international trading system. It's really strained the global rules and norms that have governed trade for decades.
At the core of the global system is the World Trade Organization, the WTO. Under the WTO framework, countries commit to predictable tariff rates and non-discrimination among trading partners. There is an allowance for exceptions, notably under Article XEC of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, for actions deemed necessary to protect national security. Historically, this security exception was understood to be a very narrow escape hatch, rarely invoked and generally reserved for genuinely extraordinary situations like wartime.
But in the past few years, the U.S. has significantly expanded the invocation of national security as a justification for trade measures. The Trump administration's tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, for example, were imposed under Section 232 of a different law, but were explicitly justified on national security grounds, even against close allies like Canada and Germany. And the Biden administration's sweeping technology export controls and investment restrictions we just discussed are likewise premised on protecting national security. Many international trade experts view these actions as clearly testing, or perhaps even breaking, the boundaries of what the WTO rules originally intended by a security exception.
And not surprisingly, these U.S. measures have triggered formal legal disputes within the WTO. In 2018, several countries filed complaints against Trump's metal tariffs. In late 2022, a WTO dispute panel issued a ruling finding that in those specific cases, the U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs violated WTO obligations, and that the national security justification invoked by the U.S. did not meet the criteria of the GATT Article XEM exception.
Essentially, the panel ruled that the security justification was not self-judging and absolute, and that the U.S. hadn't demonstrated a sufficient connection between the tariffs and a genuine security emergency in this instance, implying the tariffs were more akin to economic protectionism. The United States reacted very strongly, even angrily, as sources describe. It rejected the WTO panel's findings outright.
The U.S. maintained its position that issues of national security are not appropriate for WTO review, arguing that each country must be the sole judge of its own security needs, and that the WTO has no business second-guessing that. This stance is consistent with the U.S. position that has led to the paralysis of the WTO's appellate body, effectively blocking binding dispute resolution in cases the U.S. dislikes.
A very similar dynamic arose with the export control dispute we discussed. When China filed its WTO suit in December 2022 over the U.S. chip export restrictions, the U.S. again asserted that these were national security measures categorically exempt from trade obligations, and that the WTO is not the appropriate forum to evaluate them.
By taking this stance, the U.S. is essentially signaling that on matters it deems related to national security, it will act unilaterally and will not accept adverse rulings from the WTO. This position significantly undermines the premise of the WTO as a system of binding dispute resolution based on agreed-upon rules. If a major member like the U.S. invokes a broad exception and then ignores the trade body's adjudication, it effectively creates a loophole that could nullify that part of the WTO system for everyone. U.S. actions, like rejecting WTO rulings on security justification for tariffs export controls, are testing WTO limits and contributing to its potential weakening. That's a major takeaway.
And the consequence of this is a clear weakening of global trade rules and a potential fragmentation of the trading system. Other countries are observing the U.S. approach closely. If the U.S., the world's largest economy and historically a champion of the multilateral system, is willing to flout or bypass WTO disciplines under a broad security pretext, it creates a powerful incentive for others to do the same.
Indeed, since the U.S. invoked national security for steel tariffs and then dismissed the WTO ruling, we've seen several other countries more readily invoking national security or other non-economic justifications for protectionist trade moves. Russia has done it in the context of sanctions, and India has cited security for certain trade restrictions. The delicate balance within the WTO, which relies on members not abusing the vaguely defined security clause, appears to be eroding. This problem is compounded by the WTO's existing difficulties in updating its rules for new issues like digital trade or state subsidies, and the ongoing breakdown of its appellate mechanism.
What we're seeing is a drift toward a world where multilateral norms are increasingly overridden by unilateral actions based on perceived national interest or security. If this trend continues, the WTO risks becoming sidelined, with trade disputes increasingly handled not through agreed-upon rules and adjudication, but through power politics, bilateral pressure, or retaliation.
In short, the United States' assertive and expansive use of IEEPA and other emergency economic measures has put considerable stress on the international rule-based trading order, raising the specter of a more fragmented, less predictable, and potentially less secure global trade environment.
Now let's look at the reactions specifically from U.S. allies and partners. Our sources describe their reactions to these U.S. actions as notably ambivalent, or at least complex. On one hand, many U.S. allies generally share the underlying concerns that are motivating these policies. They too worry about China's trade practices, issues like IP theft, potential dominance in critical technologies, and they unequivocally condemned and responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a grave security threat.
On the other hand, these allies have often been frustrated and sometimes significantly harmed by the go-it-alone manner in which the U.S. has sometimes acted, and by the fact that U.S. measures taken in the name of security or national interests sometimes target them or inadvertently harm their own economic interests.
During the Trump administration, allies were visibly taken aback and often angered to find themselves hit with tariffs justified under a national security rationale. The EU, Canada, Mexico, Japan, and others found it frankly insulting, as one source put it, to have their steel or aluminum exports treated as a security risk to the U.S.
They responded forcefully, both diplomatically and with retaliatory tariffs of their own, and by filing WTO cases against the U.S. measures. Canada, for instance, pointed out the absurdity of treating Canadian metals as a security threat when Canadian soldiers fight alongside Americans in joint military operations.
Likewise, when the Trump administration threatened broad auto tariffs, also under national security grounds, and then the Mexico tariffs over immigration, it triggered what sources describe as frantic diplomacy by allies trying to avoid getting hit. The overall effect was a significant strain on trust within alliances. Allies felt the U.S. was using national security as a convenient cover for protectionism or mercantilism, and that long-standing partnerships were being undervalued or even actively harmed. This situation politically boosted the arguments of those within allied nations who advocate for greater strategic autonomy, meaning reducing their own dependence on the U.S., so they are less vulnerable to sudden shifts in U.S. policy.
Under President Biden, the overall tone with allies certainly improved compared to the Trump years, with a greater emphasis on consultation and coordination. But some policies have still caused friction. The sweeping 2022 semiconductor export controls against China, for example, were intended to be coordinated with allies, but the initial unilateral announcement by the U.S. left key partners like South Korea and the Netherlands in a difficult position, requiring significant, heavy consultation after the fact to bring them on board with similar measures.
European officials, while largely sympathetic to the strategic goal of slowing China's military tech development, expressed concern about the lack of prior consultation and the potential negative impact on their own industries. And it wasn't just IEEPA-related actions. The Biden administration's large legislative package of green subsidies, the Inflation Reduction Act, also significantly blindsided European and Asian allies, showing a broader U.S. tendency to prioritize its own domestic economic interests, even at allies' expense, again necessitating later diplomatic damage control.
Another persistent issue causing friction is the extraterritorial reach of U.S. sanctions and export bans. When the U.S. designates a foreign company, say a Chinese tech firm, for sanctions or export controls under IEEPA or related laws, it often means that companies in allied countries that supply that blacklisted firm must also cut off their sales or risk facing U.S. penalties themselves.
This can cause significant economic pain for allied businesses and governments, and it breeds resentment that U.S. law is effectively dictating their commerce and foreign policy in certain areas. A prominent example was the Trump administration's 2018 decision to exit the Iran nuclear deal and reimpose extensive sanctions, largely via IEEPA authorities. This forced European companies to abandon billions of dollars in business opportunities in Iran, and the EU was so annoyed it invoked a symbolic blocking statute to forbid EU companies from complying with the U.S. sanctions, though its practical effect was limited. In the current context of escalating U.S.-China tensions and U.S. blacklistings, allied governments and companies remain wary that they could be forced to make difficult choices or comply with U.S. decrees that harm their own interests. Allies are often frustrated by unilateral U.S. actions and their extraterritorial reach, which strains trust, but they do align on core security threats like Russia.
However, it's very important to balance that with the fact that allies have largely aligned with the U.S. on what they perceive as truly critical security sanctions. The response to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 is the prime example. The sweeping financial sanctions imposed by the U.S. were mirrored almost lockstep by the EU, UK, Japan, Canada, and other partners.
This joint effort demonstrated that when there is a clear-cut, internationally recognized security threat, especially one involving blatant aggression, U.S. emergency economic powers can be a powerful unifying force rather than a divisive one. The Russia case arguably set a positive precedent for collective action using economic tools on an unprecedented scale. The coalition showed that democracies working together could deploy financial sanctions with incredible speed and magnitude, presenting a remarkably united front against an aggressor. From the Allies' perspective, acting together ensured burden sharing and increased the legitimacy and impact of the measures.
Yet, even in the success of the Russia sanctions coalition, the actions carried significant implications for the global order. They vividly underscored the West's, and particularly the US's, dominance in the global financial system, the power of the US dollar, the centrality of systems like SWIFT. This demonstration of power was noted by countries like China and India, prompting accelerated efforts to reduce their future dependence on Western-controlled finance and infrastructure.
Allies and neutral nations alike observed that the U.S. and its partners possessed the power to effectively freeze a major economy out of the global financial system overnight. While broadly justified and necessary in that specific instance, it was a potent demonstration of raw financial power that others understandably fear could one day be used against them. In essence, while allies supported the principle when applied to Russia, the precedent set by actions like freezing central bank assets has prompted even friendly nations to consider developing alternative systems or diversifying their own reserves.
Examples include ongoing discussions in Europe about strengthening the euro's role in international finance to reduce dependence on the dollar, or China's persistent push to promote the yuan for international trade settlements and develop its own interbank messaging system as a SWIFT alternative. These aren't happening in a vacuum.
In conclusion, the reactions from international allies to the U.S.'s expanding use of IEEPA and emergency economic powers are really a mix of cooperation, adaptation, and cautious hedging. They often agree with the strategic goals, particularly regarding China and Russia, but they strongly desire consultation and a say in how measures that impact them are implemented. When they feel excluded or harmed, it can lead to trade spats, diplomatic rifts, and a strain on trust. But when brought in and consulted, the potential for collective action, as seen with Russia sanctions, is immense, though even then, the raw power displayed could be unsettling to the global balance.
This situation has clearly impelled allies to seek more predictability and reliability from the U.S. Some have entered negotiations for new frameworks, like the ongoing EU-US discussions aimed at resolving the steel tariff issue and potentially establishing a new standard for addressing concerns outside of the traditional WTO framework. There's also intensified transatlantic dialogue on export controls to ensure closer alignment from the outset. Ultimately, what's at stake is trust in U.S. leadership in the global economy. Allies are much more likely to follow the U.S.'s lead if they perceive it as acting multilaterally and judiciously rather than unpredictably or unilaterally. The recent period has provided examples of both, and allied trust has been tested but perhaps not fundamentally broken yet.
Okay, so we've looked at the global impact, how it's straining the WTO, and how allies are reacting. To quickly recap, the U.S. is testing the limits of the WTO's security exception and rejecting the WTO's authority to review those claims, which risks weakening global rules. Allies share U.S. concerns but are frustrated by unilateral U.S. actions and their extraterritorial reach, which strains trust, but they've also shown they can align with the U.S. on clear crises like Russia, demonstrating IEEPA can be a unifying tool. And these U.S. actions are prompting other countries, including allies and adversaries, to seek alternatives to the U.S.-centric financial system. That covers the global ripples on allies and the system itself.
Right. Now let's move into Chapter 6, A Changing World Order. Response from Rivals and Norms in Flux. As you might expect, the U.S.'s increasing reliance on IEEPA and aggressive economic statecraft doesn't happen in a vacuum. It prompts direct responses from adversary nations and rivals, contributing to a climate of escalating, sometimes tit-for-tat, economic measures.
Chief among these is, of course, China, which has been the primary target of many of the recent U.S. emergency economic policies we've discussed, particularly regarding technology and trade. In reaction to this sustained pressure, Beijing has been actively developing its own legal and policy arsenal designed to retaliate against U.S. actions or mitigate their impact.
This includes new Chinese laws enacted in recent years. For example, the Unreliable Entities List, which targets foreign companies that are seen as cutting off normal business ties or supplies to Chinese firms for non-commercial, politically motivated reasons. And an anti-foreign sanctions law, which explicitly allows China to impose counter-sanctions against foreign individuals, entities, or organizations that implement foreign sanctions against Chinese interests. They've also significantly beefed up their own domestic export control laws, mirroring some Western practices.
And throughout 2023 and 2024, as U.S. tech restrictions tightened, China began to use its own economic leverage, particularly its position as a critical supplier of certain commodities essential for high-tech manufacturing. A notable example occurred in mid-2023 when China announced export restrictions on 8 categories of products containing gallium and 6 containing germanium.
These are relatively minor metals, but they are absolutely essential components in advanced semiconductors, fiber optics, and other high-tech applications. China is a leading global producer and refiner of these minerals. Beijing explicitly cited its own national security interests as the reason for these curbs, and the timing, coming shortly after major U.S. chip bans, clearly signaled this was a direct countermove in the escalating chip war, designed to inconvenience high-tech industries in the U.S. and its allies.
Similarly, in May 2023, China's cybersecurity regulator effectively banned major Chinese infrastructure operators from buying chips from Micron Technology, a large U.S. memory chip company. The regulator claimed Micron products posed serious network security risks.
This action against Micron was widely interpreted as Beijing's first significant counterblow, directly targeting a U.S. firm in response to Washington's restrictions on Chinese tech companies like Huawei and SMIC. And notably, Chinese state media explicitly framed it as a necessary counter to U.S. pressure on China's semiconductor sector.
These Chinese measures function as clear mirror images of U.S. tactics. When the U.S. says, "You can't buy our chips or tools," China responds, in effect, "then you can't buy our critical raw materials or sell your products in our massive market." The emergence of this action-reaction cycle, where each side uses economic leverage against the other, significantly raises the risk of a downward spiral toward broader economic decoupling between the world's 2 largest economies.
And it underscores a crucial point. Other powerful countries like China are not passive targets of U.S. economic statecraft. They possess their own leverage, whether it's control over critical resources, access to their domestic market, or regulatory power, and they are increasingly willing and able to use it to strike back or to raise the costs of U.S. actions.
Beyond China, other states labeled as adversaries by the U.S. have also adjusted their strategies in response to U.S. economic pressure. Russia, facing the most extensive set of Western sanctions ever imposed on a major economy, has deepened its economic and political ties with non-Western partners like China and Iran, specifically seeking alternative payment mechanisms and supply chains that operate outside the reach of U.S. and Western financial systems.
Russia and China in particular have accelerated efforts toward de-dollarization, actively seeking to reduce their reliance on the U.S. dollar for international trade and finance, precisely to limit their exposure to future U.S. sanctions. They are conducting more bilateral trade in their own currencies like rubles or yuan, establishing currency swap lines, and promoting indigenous financial messaging systems as alternatives to the U.S.-dominated SWIFT system. While these alternatives are still nascent and face significant hurdles, the trend is directly accelerated by perceived U.S. willingness to use its financial centrality as a weapon. Countries like Iran, long under IEEPA sanctions, have similarly been forced to rely on barter trade and regional markets to survive, illustrating how targeted states adapt over time. U.S. economic actions are prompting adversaries like China, counter-sanctions export curbs, and Russia, de-dollarization alternative systems, to build resilience and retaliate, increasing decoupling risks significantly. And there's a broader normative effect at play here that goes beyond just adversaries. Countries that are not formal U.S. allies are observing how easily the U.S. can declare emergencies and deploy IEEPA-based measures. This might lead them to either try to emulate that power if they have the capacity, or to feel vulnerable and band together with others to resist what they perceive as Western economic dominance. For instance, a number of countries in the global south expressed discomfort that the U.S.-led sanctions on Russia were imposed without explicit UN Security Council authorization, fearing that such a precedent might someday be used unilaterally against others.
Some of these countries have called for strengthening international law to govern the use of sanctions and economic coercion, potentially under UN auspices, though the sources suggest prospects for achieving global consensus on that, particularly among the major powers, are currently quite dim. Instead, what we are largely seeing is a quiet diversification strategy. Even nations generally friendly with the U.S. are starting to hedge their bets, not wanting to be too dependent on any single power's goodwill or subject to sudden policy shifts.
One clear consequence of this intensifying geopolitical economic competition is the discernible move towards the formation of economic blocs or spheres of influence, often driven by security concerns. The term decoupling has entered common usage, referring to the partial unwinding of deeply intertwined trade, investment, and technological links between the U.S. and China.
While full, complete decoupling is neither feasible nor desired by most multinational businesses, both governments are actively pushing for greater self-reliance, or at least reduced dependency, in critical sectors. They want to ensure they cannot be held hostage by the other side in the crisis. U.S. IEEPA actions, like the tech export controls, have arguably accelerated China's push towards its dual circulation strategy, emphasizing domestic production and seeking alternative non-U.S. suppliers for critical components. Likewise, U.S. policymakers increasingly talk of friendshoring or ally-shoring supply chains, encouraging companies to source key materials and products from politically reliable nations, even if it means higher costs compared to sourcing from potential adversaries. This reorientation of global investment and trade patterns is being driven significantly by national security imperatives.
Furthermore, the U.S.'s comfort with using extraordinary economic measures appears to be inspiring other countries. A growing number of nations are testing the waters of their own emergency or security-justified economic actions. For example, India has openly invoked national security as the justification for banning dozens of Chinese mobile apps, an action that observers note was clearly inspired by the U.S. example with TikTok and WeChat.
India also instituted sudden export bans on certain commodities, like wheat in 2022, citing food security concerns. While this wasn't a sanction in the IEEPA sense, it reflects a similar ethos of prioritizing perceived emergency domestic needs over global trade commitments. Turkey has used emergency economic decrees during past financial crises. Each case has its specific context, but collectively, these examples indicate a greater readiness worldwide to use extraordinary trade and economic measures in the face of real or perceived crises, even if those measures might seem to flout prior international commitments or norms.
In essence, the U.S.'s increased reliance on IEEPA and similar tools for strategic competition has contributed to a global climate where economic statecraft is now more actively and perhaps more aggressively practiced by many nations. Adversaries are responding in kind, which heightens the potential for conflict, and even neutral countries are adopting similar tactics or adjusting their strategies to secure their own autonomy and resilience.
The inherent risk here is that if every major power starts routinely leveraging trade and financial interdependence as a weapon in geopolitical competition, the fundamental stability and predictability of the international economic system could significantly diminish. We risk entering an era of what could be called competitive unilateralism, where the default response to a dispute or a perceived threat is not to seek compromise through multilateral institutions or established rules, but to impose some restriction or counter-restriction based solely on national power. Smaller countries lacking that power could find themselves increasingly caught in the crossfire or pressured to align with one emerging bloc or another, further fragmenting the global market.
This trend towards using emergency economic powers for broad trade and investment goals raises deep questions about global governance and the core norms that have underpinned the international economic order since World War II. A clear emerging reality is that geopolitics and national security considerations are now fundamentally inseparable from trade and economic policy. The post-Cold War idea that globalization would proceed relatively insulated from major political conflicts has evaporated. We are clearly in an era where economic interdependence itself is being wielded as a strategic weapon. This shift is both driving and being driven by changes in fundamental international norms.
A key norm being tested is the idea of what constitutes a legitimate use of economic power in the international sphere. Traditional international law saw economic sanctions primarily in the context of formal warfare, or as measures collectively endorsed by the UN Security Council. What we're seeing now is a normalization of using unilateral sanctions, export controls, and investment restrictions as routine tools in peacetime strategic competition.
The U.S. and like-minded countries argue these measures are necessary to address the complex threats of the 21st century, preventing authoritarian regimes from leveraging advanced technologies for military advantage, countering cyber threats, responding to human rights abuses. They might point to China's military-civil fusion strategy or its actions in Xinjiang as justifications. However, other countries, particularly those outside the U.S. orbit, view this trend with deep suspicion. Without clear multilateral agreements or criteria, each country's unilateral definition of what constitutes a security threat could expand indefinitely. Today, it's chips or military technology. Tomorrow, the concern is it could be expanded to things like food supply disruptions or climate-related issues, potentially leading to economically devastating measures under a security guise. There's a nascent, difficult international debate about establishing guidelines or guardrails for responsible state behavior in the use of economic tools, but consensus among major powers is, well, far off. The lines between security and trade are blurring, normalizing the use of economic tools in peacetime competition and raising questions about legitimate use, potentially leading to a fragmented, less rule-based global order.
In response to this fluid and less predictable situation, new coalitions and frameworks are starting to form outside of or parallel to traditional institutions like the WTO. For example, the US, EU, and a few key partners are working on initiatives to coordinate their export controls on emerging technologies so that they present a more united front and close potential loopholes. Similarly, bilateral and multilateral forums like the Trade and Technology Council between the US and EU aim to bridge regulatory gaps and collaboratively set norms for technology governance and supply chain security.
While these new initiatives are positive steps toward collaboration among like-minded partners, they are by definition exclusive. They involve primarily advanced democratic economies, often sidelining the broader membership of institutions like the WTO. This risks entrenching a two-tier world with separate technological standards and trade rules for different blocs.
Another evolving norm is a prioritization of supply chain resilience and de-risking. After experiencing the disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic, trade wars, and geopolitical tensions, many countries now widely accept that national security includes having secure, reliable supply chains for critical goods, from semiconductors to medical supplies to rare earth minerals.
This acceptance has led to a global increase in domestic stockpiling, government-supported efforts to diversify suppliers away from potential adversaries, and significant government intervention in markets through targeted industrial policies, subsidies, and incentives. Examples include the U.S. CHIPS Act, funding domestic semiconductor manufacturing, the EU's Similar Chips Act, and India's production-linked incentives for various industries. In a significant shift from recent decades, government intervention in markets for security or resilience reasons is becoming normalized, a considerable departure from the more free market neoliberal norms that dominated global economic thinking from the 1990s through the early 2000s. If many countries are simultaneously subsidizing key industries and selectively trading or investing for security reasons, the global economy risks becoming more managed, more fragmented, and potentially less efficient than it would be under purely market-driven principles.
At the global governance level, the existing institutions are visibly struggling to adapt to this new reality. The WTO, as we've discussed, is largely stalemated on these new issues, which is why disputes are increasingly handled through political pressure rather than adjudicating under rules. Other institutions like the UN Security Council are often limited by vetoes, hence the turn to coalitions of the willing or unilateral measures. There have been calls from some quarters for a fundamental redesign of international economic rules, a kind of Bretton Woods tea, to fit the new realities of digital trade, cyber threats, climate change, and geopolitical competition. But achieving global agreement on such a redesign is extraordinarily challenging in the current environment of intense rivalries.
One interesting, almost paradoxical effect of U.S. actions is that they simultaneously undermine some global norms while trying to reinforce others. For instance, the sweeping U.S. sanctions against Russia were widely supported by allies and arguably reinforced the international norm that invading a sovereign neighbor is unacceptable and will be met with severe consequences, upholding a fundamental principle of international law. At the same time, the U.S.'s willingness to bypass or dismiss the WTO when its security claims are questioned arguably undermines the norms of the multilateral trade law system itself. So we see a selective evolution of the global order, maybe a harsher, more united stance on certain security violations, but also a more realpolitik, less rule-bound approach to international economic commitments, especially in trade.
From the perspective of many countries around the world, There's a clear desire to establish guardrails to prevent the unfettered use of economic weapons that can cause widespread harm. Some economists and diplomats suggest trying to craft an international understanding that certain areas should be off limits, perhaps establishing a humanitarian norm that essential goods like food or medicine should never be restricted for civilian populations, even in conflict, or developing commitments not to weaponize financial infrastructure in ways that create systemic risk for the global economy. But the difficulty, of course, lies in achieving trust and effective enforcement mechanisms in a world of competing powers.
For the United States and its democratic allies, one significant challenge going forward is how to preserve liberal values, openness, rule of law, multilateralism, while increasingly relying on tools like sanctions, export controls, and investment restrictions, which are by their nature coercive, discretionary, and often illiberal. If these tools are not applied carefully, transparently, and in clear alignment with stated goals, they can easily appear hypocritical or self-serving, eroding the moral high ground and alienating potential partners.
Experts argue for greater oversight and clearer criteria for deploying these measures to ensure they genuinely target security threats or human rights abuses and aren't simply captured by domestic protectionist lobbies or used for narrow political gain. The Biden administration, for its part, has often tried to frame its most impactful measures, like the tech controls, as narrowly tailored and aimed at specific capabilities, not broad economic harm, in an attempt to reassure the world that it's not simply launching a new Cold War. How convincing these assurances are will significantly affect the evolution of global norms.
If other countries perceive the U.S. as acting judiciously and targeting genuine, serious threats with precision, they may gradually accept a new norm of targeted decoupling or de-risking for security. If they see it primarily as the U.S. using its dominance to maintain its economic advantage under the cover of security, they are more likely to resist, promote norms of non-interference in internal affairs, and actively seek alternatives to the U.S.-centric system.
Finally, in terms of global governance, the assertive use of IEEPA and related powers underscores the continued centrality of the U.S. in the international system. Its economic size, the dollar's dominance, U.S. control over key technological and financial choke points, and its network of treaty alliances all mean that when America uses these powers, it has an outsized impact globally, for good or ill.
And this very centrality, combined with the increased willingness to use unilateral tools, has prompted discussions among other major economies, China, yes, but also the EU, India, Russia, and others about building alternative institutions, new payment systems, regional trade agreements that explicitly exclude the U.S. or reduce dollar reliance, or forums like BRICS discussing financial cooperation independent of Western-led systems. So far, these alternatives are nascent, but their trajectory will likely depend heavily on how the U.S. is perceived to wield its economic might going forward.
If it's seen as increasingly unilateral, unpredictable, or purely self-interested, the incentive to create a parallel, non-U.S.-centric system grows stronger. If the U.S. can manage to lead in a way that is viewed as legitimate, perhaps helping to build new rules even if they operate outside the old WTO framework, other countries might continue to integrate with or at least acquiesce to U.S.-centric systems, albeit perhaps with more caution. Okay, zooming out to the global level, we've seen how the U.S.'s use of IEP and similar powers has triggered direct responses from adversaries like China, who are developing countermeasures, raising the risk of a spiral towards economic decoupling. This era is actively reshaping international norms, blurring the lines between security and trade, and prompting countries, including allies and neutrals, to seek alternatives to U.S.-centric financial and trade systems. While there are efforts among allies to form new coalitions for things like tech export controls, the existing global governance institutions are struggling to adapt, suggesting a potential future of more fragmented economic blocs unless some new consensus on the use of these powerful tools can be found. That's a pretty comprehensive picture of the global impact, the responses from rivals, and the norms that are in flux. It really highlights the transformation of the global economic landscape.
It does, and it brings us right back to the beginning, doesn't it? Thinking about that immense power concentrated in the executive branch here at home.
Which leads us to Chapter 7, Risk of Constitutional Crisis. When emergency powers collide with governance, this is the crucial, perhaps most concerning, question our sources grapple with. Could an aggressive or novel invocation of IEPA authorities actually lead to a constitutional crisis in the United States?
A constitutional crisis is a pretty serious concept. It generally refers to a standoff or a breakdown in the constitutional system that the normal mechanisms struggle to resolve. It could involve one branch of government fundamentally defying the lawful authority of another, or ambiguous constitutional provisions leading to a breakdown in governance or the rule of law itself.
Our sources outline several scenarios where expansive IEPA use might potentially push the U.S. government towards such a crisis point. One major scenario is direct defiance of congressional will. This could happen if a president uses IEPA to effectively override or circumvent a decision Congress has made or refused to make.
For example, imagine Congress explicitly refuses to fund a certain program or enact a controversial policy. Could a president then declare a national emergency and use IEPA measures to accomplish something similar unilaterally? Sources point to President Trump's emergency declaration to fund his border wall after Congress declined to appropriate the full amount requested, though, that relied on the National Emergencies Act and military construction statutes, not IEPA. It serves as an illustration of using emergency powers for what Congress refused. In the economic realm, consider if a president declared a financial emergency to, say, unilaterally circumvent the debt ceiling or essentially appropriate funds for a domestic program, actions that are squarely in Congress's domain under Article 1.
Or, going back to the tariff example we keep discussing, using IEEPA to impose across-the-board tariffs, essentially a tax on imports against Congress's clear wishes or stated trade policy. This scenario directly pits the president's Article 2 executive and emergency powers against Congress's Article 1 powers over taxing and regulating commerce. If Congress strongly opposes such an action, but lacks the two-thirds supermajority required by the NEA to terminate the emergency, you have this profound impasse where the executive is doing something the legislature actively forbid or refuse to authorize.
This could lead to a crisis of legitimacy, as some scholars warn. The president is seen as usurping legislative power, and Congress is seen as unable to effectively check him within the normal constitutional framework. As sources note, IEP was fundamentally meant for foreign crises, not to displace non-emergency laws or bypass Congress's core policy role. Using it to essentially nullify Congress's preference on a major economic issue would severely test the separation of powers.
A potentially even more acute form of crisis could emerge if the executive branch were to defy a direct court order involving IEPA. We've seen that courts have shown a willingness to review and invalidate specific IEPA actions when they overstep statutory bounds, like the injunctions against the TikTok and WeChat bans, or earlier injunctions against aspects of sanctions targeting the International Criminal Court.
In all these past instances mentioned in the sources, the executive branch, after initially losing in court, ultimately complied with the injunctions or changed course the system held. But imagine a scenario where a president is determined to press forward with an IEPA action deemed essential for urgent national security, and a court orders a stop. A determined president might be tempted to simply ignore the judicial ruling, claiming that the courts cannot interfere in such critical security matters. Such an act of defying a lawful court order would be a direct constitutional crisis, as it fundamentally calls into question the judiciary's authority, established way back in Marbury v. Madison, to say what the law is and whether the executive is acting legally.
In the hypothetical worst-case scenario surrounding the 2020 election, there were fears, thankfully unrealized, that President Trump or some of his allies might attempt to invoke emergency powers and disregard court or congressional actions in an effort to remain in power. Had he, for example, invoked IEP or other emergency authorities to seize voting machines or interfere with election processes under the pretext of countering foreign interference, an idea reportedly floated by some advisors and a court ordered it to stop, a refusal to comply would have plunged the nation into genuinely uncharted and dangerous waters. That specific crisis was averted, but the episode highlighted how emergency powers, including IEP, could potentially be misused in a way that puts the president directly at odds with the judiciary's fundamental authority, raising the specter of a constitutional meltdown if those checks failed.
Another concerning scenario involves stretching the definition of IEPA's scope by blurring the line between domestic and foreign threats. IEP authority is clearly limited to unusual and extraordinary threats, originating largely from abroad. But a creative executive might try to frame a predominantly domestic problem as having sufficient foreign connections to declare an international emergency and unlock IEPA powers.
For example, a president could declare climate change a national security threat, citing foreign contributions to emissions or the geopolitical instability caused by climate effects, and then use IEPA to control domestic industries, perhaps restricting oil exports, seizing assets of fossil fuel companies, or mandating changes to the domestic energy grid actions normally governed by extensive domestic law and regulation and requiring congressional action.
Or declare an economic emergency based on foreign influence in domestic markets or supply chains, and then intervene directly in domestic industries in ways normally outside presidential authority. If such moves clearly cross into areas like domestic energy production or regulating the internet or other sectors normally governed by domestic statutes and involving significant private property rights, it could trigger massive political backlash and widespread legal challenges. A constitutional crisis might then loom if the president insists on pursuing the action, perhaps vetoing congressional attempts to terminate the emergency via the NEA process, effectively nullifying the legislative branch's policy preference on a core domestic issue. The structure of the NEA, which gives the president effective veto power over ending an emergency unless Congress can muster a two-thirds supermajority, almost seems to invite this kind of conflict and impasse. Repeated clashes of this sort could significantly erode respect for the constitutional equilibrium and be seen as a breakdown in governance, particularly if the policy at issue is hugely consequential for American society and the economy.
The most profound potential crisis would be if IEEPA, or similar emergency powers, were misused in a way that undermines core democratic or constitutional functions, particularly those related to elections or the peaceful transfer of power. While IEEPA is primarily an economic authority, its breadth over transactions and communications could, in a worst-case scenario, be twisted to disrupt processes crucial to the functioning of democracy.
For instance, abusing IEP under the guise of countering foreign election interference to interfere with the actual conduct or certification of elections, which are constitutionally state and congressional functions, could directly threaten the constitutional transfer of power. As noted in that alarming 2020 election scenario, some allies of the president pondered invoking emergency powers, though precisely which ones wasn't always clear, to delay or influence the outcome. While the Constitution provides no mechanism for a president to suspend the Constitution or cancel an election, a misuse of IEP, say, attempting to shut down certain media channels or aspects of the internet under a flimsy guise of countering a foreign cyber threat related to the election, could still disrupt the process and create chaos. Scenarios where IEP could lead to constitutional crisis include: President defies Congress, for example on tariffs, defies courts, injunctions, stretches foreign power to domestic issues, climate, markets, or interferes with democratic processes like elections. Now, it's crucial to step back and note that not every controversial or aggressive use of IEPA has triggered a full-blown constitutional crisis thus far. The U.S. constitutional system has built-in mechanisms designed precisely for resolving disputes between the branches and checking potential overreach. Courts can review the legality of executive actions, Congress has powers of the purse, oversight hearings, and the ability to pass new legislation to clarify or constrain authorities. And elections, ultimately, can redirect policy and leadership.
We've seen how vigorous use of IEPA, even arguably aggressive or novel uses, has led to political and legal pushback within the system's normal functioning. President Trump's emergency declaration for border wall funding, while not an IEPA case, was hotly contested but ultimately adjudicated in courts and debated by voters and didn't lead to a breakdown of government.
Similarly, the IEPA-based measures from the Trump administration that were struck down by courts, like the TikTok WeChat bans or sanctions targeting international criminal court officials, did not result in the president defying the courts. He complied, albeit perhaps grudgingly. In those instances, the constitutional order held because the executive ultimately respected the judiciary's role.
However, the risk of a genuine constitutional crisis grows significantly if a president refuses to yield when one of the other branches attempts to check their power. The current emergency powers framework, particularly the NEA structure with its difficult veto override, relies a great deal on presidential good faith, restraint, and respect for the co-equal branches. A president determined to push the boundaries of executive power could potentially exploit the ambiguities within IEEPA until either Congress or the courts push back forcefully, and if that president then refuses to accept that pushback as legitimate, the stage is truly set for a constitutional crisis.
In other words, because IEEPA concentrates so much unilateral authority in the executive, it could be the specific tool a recalcitrant president chooses to use to push the system to a breaking point, challenging the fundamental balance of power.
The judiciary certainly acts as a vital, albeit sometimes slow and infrequent, brake on potential abuses. The courts have shown they will enforce clear statutory limits and protect fundamental rights, saying no to the president when IEEPA is misused in the specific instances that have reached them. This provides some deterrent effect. Presidents know that an extreme or clearly unlawful action might not survive in court, which can sometimes temper the most aggressive impulses.
However, court processes are inherently slow compared to the speed at which an executive can declare an emergency and issue orders. And there is always the potential danger of courts being more deferential to the executive in areas they deem inherently political questions or core national security matters, where judges might hesitate to interfere with the president's judgment. Some judges might be reluctant to block, say, a sanctions regime imposed during an active geopolitical conflict, even if its legal basis is questionable.
So in that worst-case scenario, where all these checks potentially fail, a president hell-bent on using IEP in an unprecedented, arguably unlawful way, a Congress unable to quickly unite to stop it due to polarization or procedural hurdles, and judicial review that is either slow, uncertain, or disregarded, that's where a constitutional crisis could manifest. For instance, if in 2025 a president were to implement nationwide tariffs via IEEPA against Congress's explicit recent will on trade policy, and then simply ignore a court injunction issued against those tariffs, you would see immediate turmoil in financial markets and the economy, confusion among allies, the branches of government, and fundamental loggerheads, and no immediate clear constitutional resolution.
In such a situation, the system would face immense pressure, and resolution might require extraordinary measures, perhaps impeachment proceedings, mass resignations of officials unwilling to comply with unlawful orders, or other forms of extra-constitutional improvisation, all of which would be clear indicators of a true constitutional crisis.
So, to conclude this section on the domestic risks, IEPA is undoubtedly a powerful and, in genuine emergencies, a necessary instrument for the president to protect national security. But its breadth, combined with the practical difficulty of congressional checks under the current National Emergencies Act framework, makes it susceptible to misuse and raises the potential for it to become a tool that could strain or even fray the constitutional fabric of the United States, particularly the separation of powers.
The courts have demonstrated a willingness to enforce limits, affirming that statutory text and constitutional rights do bind the executive, even in an emergency. And the constitutional structure provides remedies. Congress can legislate or terminate emergencies if it can muster the necessary votes, and courts can invalidate unlawful executive actions. These mechanisms have, thankfully, prevented any descent into a true constitutional crisis so far. The fact that the executive has, in key instances, complied with judicial injunctions has diffused past potential conflicts. But the risk remains, highlighting how much the system relies on presidential restraint and vigilant oversight from Congress and the courts to prevent a breakdown.
That wraps up our look at the potential for a constitutional crisis. We've explored how IEPA's power and weak checks could allow a president to potentially defy Congress or the courts, or push foreign emergency powers into domestic areas. We've seen how the current system, particularly the National Emergencies Act, makes it hard for Congress to step in. And while the judiciary offers some limits, their effectiveness can be slow, and there's that question of deference in national security cases. The real danger we discussed is if a president were to push the system hard enough and refuse to back down, potentially using IEPA as the tool to reach that breaking point. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We started with the origins of IEP in a moment, when Congress wanted to limit executive power, but ended up creating this tool with broad potential.
Yes, and we've seen how that potential has been realized and expanded in recent administrations, particularly the ways emergency powers have been used for purposes closely related to trade, technology competition, and broader economic statecraft, stretching the definition of threat from abroad.
We've scrutinized the significant domestic implications, the tension with Congress's constitutional authority over trade, the concerns about executive overreach, and the risk of perpetual emergencies, and the potential, though thankfully averted so far, for serious constitutional friction with the other branches.
And we've analyzed the global ripples, how the U.S.'s assertive use of these tools is straining the multilateral trading system, creating friction with allies, even while sometimes enabling coordination, and prompting adversaries to develop countermeasures and seek alternatives, all contributing to a reshaping of international norms around economic power.
It really highlights the duality of IEPA's recent use. On one hand, it demonstrates the undeniable agility and potency of executive economic power in a fast-moving and complex world. This ability to act quickly can be incredibly valuable in responding to genuine crises, countering strategic threats, or punishing clear aggression, as we saw with the Russia sanctions. It supports the argument that in an era of interconnected threats, the executive needs broad latitude to act decisively in the national interest.
Yet, on the other hand, these developments unquestionably set concerning precedents that raise long-term risks. Domestically, using emergency powers for matters that look increasingly like ordinary policy or political objectives risks hollowing out the legislative branch's authority and moving the U.S. system closer to an imperial presidency, especially in the economic realm. The more presidents rely on IEEPA as a workaround instead of seeking specific legislation, the more that risk grows.
And internationally, the uses of IEP and similar authorities by the world's largest economy have been equally transformative. They've served as both a symbol and an instrument of a world order where great power competition and national security considerations have firmly reasserted themselves into the economic sphere. The U.S. has signaled it will aggressively defend its security and national interests in the economic domain, even if that means overriding prior trade commitments or acting without broad international consensus. In doing so, it has sometimes encouraged allies to follow suit, but it has also opened the door for rivals and other nations to rationalize their own deviations from established rules.
The global trade and investment system, which for decades trended towards greater liberalization and rule-based predictability, now faces a much more uncertain future, characterized by fragmented blocs, contested norms, and increased power politics.
Managing this new reality presents significant challenges for the U.S. and the international community. Can the U.S. and like-minded partners, for instance, establish clear rules of the road or shared understandings for the use of economic coercion that prevent unchecked escalation and abuse? Can existing international institutions like the WTO somehow adapt, or will they be increasingly bypassed by new arrangements and power dynamics? And critically, within the U.S. itself, can the domestic system ensure that IEPA remains a tool subject to robust oversight and genuinely tied to acute emergencies, rather than becoming a convenient shortcut for the executive to pursue policy goals that should properly go through Congress?
The sources suggest that how the United States navigates this delicate calibration, the balance between executive agility and legislative oversight at home, and the balance between unilateral action and multilateral governance abroad, will not only define the future limits of its own presidential power, but will also significantly help set the tone for the international order in the 21st century. Getting that balance wrong risks constitutional crises at home and potentially escalating economic cold wars abroad. Getting it right means fostering a system that effectively balances the need for speed and power in a dangerous world with the fundamental requirements of accountability, rule of law, and international cooperation.
And that really leads us to a final thought. Building on the insights woven throughout this dive, the sources strongly indicate that recent presidents facing congressional division and political gridlock have found using these unilateral economic powers to be incredibly expedient and effective domestically. It's often faster, less politically messy than negotiating legislation, and can even be politically rewarding.
And crucially, once these executive actions are in place, the tariffs, the sanctions, the investment restrictions, unwinding them becomes politically costly. Removing them can be framed as weakness or being soft on adversaries, making it difficult for successor administrations to reverse course. This dynamic tends to institutionalize actions that originated as temporary emergency measures or unilateral decrees, creating a status quo that Congress never explicitly approved.
So ask yourself this. If presidents across different parties find it easier, faster, and even politically beneficial to act unilaterally on major issues of trade and economic security, and if reversing those actions later is politically difficult, are we fundamentally seeing a permanent shift in where the power over these critical economic tools and policies resides in the U.S. government, regardless of who is in the White House?
Is the exception of using emergency power in foreign economic policy truly, irreversibly becoming the rule? This delicate calibration between speed, power, domestic politics, and constitutional design is still very much in progress, with real-world consequences for all of us. Keep watching how this story unfolds.
The IEEPA was meant to limit presidential overreach. Instead, it became the quiet conduit for sweeping trade actions, sanctions, and executive improvisation, often with minimal oversight and maximal ambiguity. But that ambiguity hasn't gone unnoticed. In our next episode, we meet the legal insurgents challenging the entire premise, activists who've built a playbook to reclaim economic authority from the executive branch. They're not lobbying, they're litigating. And the courtroom is where the next fault line emerges.
Please like and subscribe.